Hi, faithful listeners. We are going to be discussing 1 Chronicles 22 today and the preparation that David does for God's temple. Speaking of David, he wrote a lot of the Psalms. He wrote all different types of Psalms. He wrote happy Psalms, sad Psalms, prayerful Psalms, joyful Psalms, and he also wrote a type of psalm called an imprecatory psalm. An imprecatory psalm is when you ask for God's judgment to be done on somebody. And so my sister and I talked yesterday about the imprecatory psalms. Can Christians pray them? Can we pray for God's judgment on our enemies? So my sister and I talked about that on the YouTube channel, which I have that video linked in the description. And I think it's a really important topic. You know, how do we deal with the anger that we feel towards people who persecute us or say nasty things about us? How, as Christians, do we handle that? So take a look at that video when you get a chance. But for now, let's go ahead and read 1 Chronicles 22, the entire thing. I'll be reading as I usually do from the WEB. I've also got my delicious cup of 7 Weeks coffee right here with me. And I haven't drank any tea in a very long period of time. And I couldn't be happier. I could not be happier over this turn of events. I love coffee. I love the smell of it. I love the taste of it. And I am just overjoyed right now to be sharing a cup of coffee with all of you wonderful, faithful listeners. So grab your cup of coffee, or I guess your cup of tea for those of you who prefer tea over coffee. And let's go ahead and read 1 Chronicles 22, the entire thing. As always, I'll be reading from the WEB. Then David said, "This is the house of Yahweh God, and this is the altar of burnt offering for Israel." David gave orders to gather together the foreigners who were in the land of Israel, and he set masons to cut dressed stones to build God's house. David prepared iron in abundance for the nails for the doors of the gates and for the couplings, and bronze in abundance without weight, and cedar trees without number, for the Sidonians and the people of Tyre brought cedar trees in abundance to David. David said, "Solomon my son is young and tender, and the house that is to be built for Yahweh must be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and of glory throughout all countries. I will therefore make preparation for it." So David prepared abundantly before his death. Then he called for Solomon his son and commanded him to build a house for Yahweh, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon his son, "As for me, it was in my heart to build a house to the name of Yahweh my God. But Yahweh's word came to me, saying, 'You have shed blood abundantly and have made great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of peace. I will give him rest from all of his enemies all around, for his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quietness to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name, and he will be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. Now, my son, may Yahweh be with you and prosper you, and build the house of Yahweh your God, as he has spoken concerning you. May Yahweh give you discretion and understanding, and put you in charge of Israel, so that you may keep the law of Yahweh your God. Then you will prosper, if you observe to do the statutes and the ordinances with which Yahweh gave Moses concerning Israel. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid, and don't be dismayed. Now behold, in my affliction I have prepared for Yahweh's house 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and bronze and iron without weight, for it is in abundance. I have also prepared timber and stone that you may add to them. There are also workmen with you in abundance, cutters and workers of stone and timber, and all kinds of men who are skillful in every kind of work. Of the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron, there is no number. Arise and be doing, and may Yahweh be with you." David also commanded all the princes of Israel to help Solomon his son, saying, "Isn't Yahweh your God with you? Hasn't he given you rest on every side? For he has delivered the inhabitants of the land into my hand, and the land is subdued before Yahweh and before his people. Now set your heart and your soul to follow Yahweh your God. Arise, therefore, and build the sanctuary of Yahweh God, and bring the ark of Yahweh's covenant and the holy vessels of God into the house that is to be built for Yahweh's name." So in this chapter, David is actually getting close to death. It kind of seems like the author of the Chronicles, who, by the way, is credited as Ezra, who was a priest of Israel, you can tell that he isn't really focusing so much on the ins and outs of David's life, like 2 Samuel was, but more so he's focusing on the things that David did, specifically regarding the history of the temple. There's already been full chapters dedicated to David's zeal, I suppose, for the temple. A chapter for him bringing the Ark of the Covenant home. A chapter for the musicians, the worshipers that David put in place for the Ark of the Covenant, and also for the tent of meeting that was in Gibeon. Not to mention in the last chapter, we talked about how David purchased this entire mountain that would eventually be the location of the temple to God, which is what it says right here in 1 Chronicles 22, verse 1. Then David said, "This is the location of the house of Yahweh God, and this is the location of the altar of burnt offering for Israel." Now, the WEB words that a little differently, but what David is discussing here is the location for the temple, which was the mountain that he purchased in the previous chapter. So David is already making all of these preparations for the temple. David desperately wanted to build this, but God told him no several chapters ago. But that didn't stop David from doing a lot of prep work. And I do wonder if it was because David didn't trust Solomon to get it all done, or if it was because David just really wanted to aid Solomon. I don't know. There could have been two things going on there. You know, this like kind of parental, I got to make sure he's doing it right. And it also could have been, I really, really want to participate in this monumental building of God's temple. So in this chapter, that is what happens. David does all of this prep work for the building of the temple in order to aid Solomon. So here's what it says in verse 2. David gave orders to gather together the foreigners who were in the land of Israel, and he set masons to cut dressed stones to build God's house. Now, this, I believe, is talked about more in depth in 1 Kings 5, 15 through 18. A lot of the stone cutters were actually foreign people that lived in Israel. This would have included prisoners of war, criminals, and slaves, not to mention also hired help as well. That's talked about a little bit in 1 Kings chapter 5, 1 through 6. And in fact, King Hiram of Tyre, who was a friend of David and Solomon, actually sent some workers of his to help Solomon as well with the building of the temple. Here's what that says. 1 Kings 5, starting in verse 1, Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon, for he had heard that they had anointed him king in the place of his father, and Hiram had always loved David. And then jumping down to verse 6, Solomon actually sends a letter to Hiram, and he says this, Therefore command that cedar trees be cut for me out of Lebanon. My servants will be with your servants, and I will give you wages for your servants according to all that you say. For you know that there is nobody among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. So there was a lot of people willing to help Solomon with this project. So it did include hired help as well, as you can see in 1 Kings chapter 5. Solomon did have hired help there as well. So there is a large amount of people that were helping with this project, and David, prepared all of this beforehand. And going back to our passage for today, verse 3, it says, David also prepared iron in abundance for the nails for the doors of the gates and for the couplings, and bronze in abundance without weight. And what's really interesting about that is iron was relatively new. In fact, these days are called the Iron Age. The Iron Age was approximately from 1000 BC to 962 BC. That included Iron Age 1 and 2. Now, the people who actually made iron famous was the Philistines and the Greeks. And you can actually see back in the days of King Saul that the Philistines were very hush-hush with how they produced their iron. Israel was not allowed to know their secrets. In fact, Israel, during the time of Saul, wasn't even allowed to have any sharp tools whatsoever. The Philistines would take them all from the Israelites so that there was only like a couple swords found hidden in Israel during that time. But you can see now during the reign of David how all of that has changed. Israel now knows the secret to ironwork because David went in and completely subdued the Philistines and took their secrets from them. So now David and his people know how to produce iron nails. It says, David prepared iron in abundance for the nails for the doors of the gates and for the couplings, and bronze in abundance without weight, and cedar trees without number. For the Sidonians and the people of Tyre brought cedar trees in abundance to David. So David was already in communication with Hiram, king of Tyre. Hiram had already been producing cedar trees for David, knowing that David was preparing this temple for Yahweh, which begs the question, was Hiram a Yahweh worshiper? Many people actually believe, yes, he was, just due to the fact that he was so gung-ho about giving gifts for the building of God's temple. He was a constant asset to David and to Solomon when it came to the building of this temple. However, scripturally, we don't know if Hiram, king of Tyre, ever became a Yahweh worshiper or not, but circumstantial evidence kind of says that he was. Then it says right here in verse 5, David said, Solomon, my son, is young and tender, and the house that is to be built for Yahweh must be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and of glory throughout all countries. I will therefore make preparation for it. So that's what I mean when I think David was, in a sense, kind of believing Solomon couldn't do it on his own. Like having this sort of like fatherly thing where he's like, no, my son can't handle this. I definitely got to step in and help. Because he calls Solomon young and tender. Solomon was not that young when all of this was taking place. He would have been most likely in his early 20s. But you can see that David treated all of his kids as if they were children, even when they were mature, grown adults. In fact, in 2 Samuel chapter 18, during the whole fiasco with Absalom, David's son, who tried to kill him and take the throne for himself, David called Absalom a young man, even though Absalom would have been most likely in his 30s to early 40s. It seems clear to me that David considered all of his children just to be young and immature, which was why it's very likely that David was not a good disciplinarian, because he always thought of his kids as being like young, innocent children. But unfortunately, that was not the case, specifically with his son Absalom, and actually many of his other sons as well. There was not just Absalom causing trouble, but many of his kids caused a lot of issues. But regardless, he considers Solomon, who was in his 20s most likely, as young and tender. But right after saying all this, he calls for Solomon his son in verse 6, and he commanded him to build a house for Yahweh, the God of Israel. And notice what David said in verse 5. He said the house for Yahweh had to be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and glory throughout all countries. So David wanted God's temple to be a beautiful showpiece, showing who Yahweh really was. And honestly, this is something the church has done for generations. It's only within the past 100 to 200 years or so that churches have become ugly. Generally speaking, when somebody went to church, they would experience beautiful music, beautiful art, beautiful architecture in every church that they stepped foot in. That was something considered to be very important to show the greatness of God. And that's something I do think, unfortunately, we have lost over the years. God gives all of us, each individual person, amazing talents that he wants us to use for the best of his ability. I mean, look at David. Just a few chapters before this, he was putting musicians in place to worship at God's temples. And these musicians were excellent, it says, excellent at what they did. And they were teaching other people who had talents how to be even more excellent. So I think that excellence is something that we've kind of lost over the years, but I do see it coming back. And I definitely don't think that Christian churches have to be in poverty in order to be holy. I know that there's a Christian poverty movement that a lot of pastors kind of go for these days, but that's also not a biblical model, not even in the New Testament. I mean, how many times do we see Paul telling people that they need to pay their pastors and their church leaders? He says it all the time. So no, the Christian poverty movement is not biblical, and anybody who thinks that churches are not holy because they are accepting payment, well, that's just not biblical. It says specifically in Scripture that God is the one who gives financial blessing. He says that. So God's temple here, David wants it to be beautiful. He wants it to be a showpiece for all of these other foreigners that are going to come into Israel and look at this temple and see how reverent and different the worship of Yahweh is compared to whatever deity these foreigners worship. So David says to Solomon, his son, in verse 7, "As for me, it was in my heart to build a house to the name of Yahweh my God. But Yahweh's word came to me saying, you have shed blood abundantly and have made great wars. You shall not build a house to my name because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of peace. I will give him rest from all of his enemies all around, for his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quietness to Israel in his days." So David received a prophecy from God. God had told David, the reason I am not having you build my temple and your son do it instead is because you are a man of war and because you have shed much blood on the earth. Whereas your son, Solomon, he is not going to be a man of war. He's going to be a man of peace. I'm going to give Israel peace from every side. And that is why Solomon is going to build this temple. So a lot of people wonder, from reading this, is God against war? Well, obviously not in every case, because in Psalm chapter 69, David actually praises God and says that God is the one who trains his arms for war. We also see in Judges chapter 1, God having the Israelites learn how to go to war. So not in every single case is God against war, because unfortunately, sometimes war is necessary, especially if aggressive people are coming up against Israel. God is not going to be against the Israelites warring against those people. And that goes for pretty much every other nation. We don't just sit back and let people take our nations from us. But I do think he is against needless war. And it could be that one of the reasons God did not allow David to do this one thing that David always wanted to do was because David may have been too harsh in war. Now, I don't know that for sure, but there are some stories, of David getting pretty crazy in the middle of war, right? But more so, I would say that the main reason God didn't want David to build the temple was because you can see here that this would have been a huge distraction to David. And if David has all of his attention focused on building this house to Yahweh, you can imagine the amount of damage that these aggressive neighbors of Israel would have done during that time period. And so maybe to avoid more senseless suffering of the Israelites, God wanted David's attention to be more towards the handling of Israel's foreign affairs rather than building the temple to God. And that's kind of actually what Solomon himself alludes to. Remember when he wrote that letter to Hiram, king of Tyre? In 1 Kings 5:3, here's what Solomon writes to Hiram. "You know that David my father could not build a house for the name of Yahweh his God because of the wars which were around him on every side until Yahweh put his enemies under the soles of his feet. But now Yahweh my God has given me rest on every side. There is no enemy and no evil occurrence. Behold, I intend to build a house for the name of Yahweh my God, as Yahweh spoke to David my father, saying, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, shall build the house for my name." That right there is pretty clear that the reason God didn't want David to build the temple was because there was too many wars happening. and the building of the temple would have taken David's attention off of these wars, and more suffering would have happened in Israel. And that's more so my viewpoint, because if you go back to 1 Chronicles 22, even David alludes to that same thing when he's talking to the princes of Israel as well. Jumping all the way down to 1 Chronicles 22:17, it says, David also commanded all the princes of Israel to help Solomon his son, saying, "Isn't Yahweh your God with you? Hasn't he given you rest on every side? For he has delivered the inhabitants of the land into my hand, and the land is subdued before Yahweh and before his people. Now set your heart and your soul to follow Yahweh your God. Arise, therefore, and build the sanctuary of Yahweh God to bring the ark of Yahweh's covenant and the holy vessels of God into the house that is to be built for Yahweh's name." So even David himself alluded to the idea that the reason he should not build this temple was because there were too many wars taking place, and that was what David needed to focus on. Not the building of God's temple. That could wait till there was a time of peace, but securing Israel, making sure that Israel was safe. Now, I don't know if David took things too far, and it could have been also a punishment for David. But once again, I'm more on the side of David needed his attentions to be on securing Israel. But jumping back to verse 11, David continues his speech to Solomon. He says, "Now, my son, may Yahweh be with you and prosper you, and build the house of Yahweh your God, as he has spoken concerning you. May Yahweh give you discretion and understanding, and put you in charge of Israel, so that you may keep the law of Yahweh your God. Then you will prosper. If you observe to do the statutes and the ordinances with which Yahweh gave Moses concerning Israel, be strong and courageous, don't be afraid, and don't be dismayed." Now we know that Solomon, David's son, became the wisest man in history. And it could be that the reason Solomon asked for that wisdom was because of what David said right here. He said in verse 12, "May Yahweh give you discretion and understanding, and put you in charge of Israel, so that you may keep the law of Yahweh your God." I do wonder if this speech just touched Solomon's heart so much that the one thing he asked God for was not for riches, not for fame, not for a long life, but instead for wisdom. And God, in fact, did give Solomon exactly what he asked for. Now, unfortunately, we know that Solomon was kind of the start of the idolatry that happened in Israel. Even though Solomon started out really good, was a very wise man, toward the end of his life, he kind of rejected a lot of that and started building these like little altars and stuff to foreign little g gods, because Solomon had a woman problem. He had like 1 million wives, and all these wives worshipped these other gods, and they were asking, hey, can you build an altar to my God? It doesn't have to be like the temple to Yahweh. It doesn't have to be that grand, but I just need a little altar, to worship this little statue that I have. So can you please do that? And Solomon was like, oh, yeah. Okay. All right. I'll let you have that. It's not like God's temple. This little altar doesn't matter much in the grand scheme of things. That was what started idolatry in Israel. Solomon's lack of being able to say no. And God punished Solomon pretty badly for this as well. And though David gives Solomon this blessing, this encouragement, unfortunately, Solomon did not follow a lot of what David asked. Yes, he built the temple, but he did not keep the ordinances that Yahweh gave to Moses in the wilderness. Solomon broke every single one of the laws for kings found in Deuteronomy, whereas David and even Saul that we know of did not break every single ordinance in Deuteronomy, but Solomon did. However, David continues his speech here. He says, "Now behold, in my affliction, I have prepared for Yahweh's house 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and bronze and iron without weight, for it is in abundance." Now, this would have been a lot of gold and a lot of silver, like thousands of tons of it. And we do know, Hiram was helping David with this project. So a lot of that could have come from Hiram. Not to mention, Israel at this point in time was very secure. David was at the end of his life. Solomon was about to take the throne. And David had a lot of nations paying tribute to Israel on a year-to-year basis. So much of this gold could have come from them. But some people do wonder if David was speaking rhetorically here, where he's kind of just like, yeah, I got you tons and tons of gold. But if I were to take a guess, I would say David was not being rhetorical, just because twice now in this chapter, it actually says the weight of all of this stuff that David acquired for the temple was without number, meaning it was weightless because of how much David was acquiring. So I'm going to guess that these are real numbers that David is throwing out there, even though this number here would have been 3,600 tons of gold and about 30,000 tons of silver. I think it is possible that David actually did acquire that much gold and silver. But I don't know. He could have been speaking rhetorically, but I am not inclined to believe so. Then in verse 15, there are also workmen with you in abundance, cutters and workers of stone and timber, and all kinds of men who are skillful in every kind of work. Notice here, David specifically wanted skillful workers. That is something that I think David was very passionate about, was people doing skillful work for God. Of the gold, of the silver, the bronze, and the iron, there is no number. Arise and be doing, and may Yahweh be with you. And then in verses 17 through 19, we actually already went over these verses, but David also commands the princes of Israel, the other leaders of Israel, to help Solomon build this temple to God because of how important this was for Israel to finally, after hundreds and hundreds of years, finally have a proper place of worship where God's presence was going to dwell in Israel. And of course, Jerusalem was a perfect location for this temple because of its prime location in the center, in the heart of Israel. So yes, we are finishing up the life of David. We only have a few more chapters in 1 Chronicles, and then we move into 2 Chronicles. So I'm trying to go a little bit faster. If you haven't noticed, we were in 1 and 2 Kings for just under a year. And so now I'm trying to make my seasons a little bit shorter, only because of the fact that when my seasons get really long, some podcast platforms refuse to show the entire season. Specifically, Apple Podcasts will only show 100 of my episodes. Even though I have significantly more than 100 episodes in each season, Apple Podcasts will only show 100. Now, that being said, I'm not going to rush through the Bible. I'm going to talk about things as they come. And if it happens that my seasons are a little bit longer, then so be it. However, 1 Chronicles so far has been chapter by chapter mostly because the chapters are talking about just the same theme. And even in today's, there was no good breakup point, if that makes sense. And that's what I've found in 1 Chronicles so far. I don't know if that's the same in 2 Chronicles. We will find out once we get there. But faithful listeners, check out that episode I did with my sister on YouTube that is linked in the description. Comment on the video, let me know what you think, and also subscribe to the YouTube channel because you're going to see more videos coming out as well. Faithful listeners, have a lovely and wonderful rest of your day. As always, happy listening, and God bless.